Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of Al-Shabaka's Policy Labs. Thank you for joining us. My name is Nadim Bawalsa. I'm the commissioning editor at Al-Shabaka. It's an honor to be with you tonight or this evening to facilitate this discussion about a very important topic, the Unity Intifada and the PLO's relationship to the ongoing liberation struggle. The visible absence of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or any leadership for that matter on the Palestinian side, from the recent Palestinian Intifada has led many to doubt the organization's validity as the so-called sole representative of the Palestinian, sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. For us at Al-Shabaka, this development is doubly important as we continue to reflect on the findings of our recent publication, Reviving a Palestinian Power, the Diaspora, and the Diplomatic Corps, a robust and critical 3-year study conducted by 4 of our analysts, Nadia Hijab, Zaha Hassan, Inès Abdel Razek, and Mona Younis. Today, perhaps more than ever, we ask, do we still need the PLO? If so, why? What are its pros and cons for realizing the Palestinian struggle for liberation? If it is still a viable and relevant entity, how can it be revived and re-engaged to effectively represent Palestinians globally in their struggle for freedom? How can it be mobilized to pursue the Israeli regime legally for its crimes? How can it be reformed and reshaped to accommodate the voices of Palestinian youth and their allies across historic Palestine and the world in what is undoubtedly the first intifada of its kind? Joining us today to reflect on these questions and more are 2 of the study's authors, Nadia Hijab and Zaha Hassan. Nadia is co-founder and honorary president of Al-Shabaka. She served as board president between 2010 and 2021, and as executive director between 2011 and 2018. A writer, public speaker, and media commentator, Nadia's first book, Woman Power, The Arab Debate on Women at Work, was published by Cambridge University Press, and she co-authored Citizens Apart, A Portrait of Palestinians in Israel. She was editor-in-chief of the London-based Middle East magazine before serving at the UN in New York. She's co-founder and former co-chair of the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and now serves on its advisory board. She continues to serve Al-Shabaka in an advisory capacity and supports its mission. Al-Shabaka policy analyst Zaha Hassan is a human rights lawyer and visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. Her research focuses on Palestine-Israel peace, the use of international legal mechanisms by political movements, and US foreign policy in the Middle East. She previously served as coordinator and senior legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team during Palestine's bid for UN membership between 2010 and 2012. She received her JD from the University of California at Berkeley and an LLM in transnational and international law from Willamette University. Thank you both for joining us today. Just to remind our audience of the format of our Policy Lab this evening. The format will be as follows. For the first 30 minutes or so, I will pose some questions to Nadia and Zaha. During the second half of the lab, our speakers will answer questions from you. Throughout the discussion, at any time, please submit your questions by clicking on Ask a Question at the bottom of the screen. And remember that you can vote on the questions you'd like asked. I'll do my best during the Q&A to address as many of your questions as possible. So with that, let's turn to our speakers. Nadia, I'd like to start with you. You spearheaded the recent study in which you, Zaha, Inès, and Mona investigated the historical and contemporary realities of the PLO and what brought it to where it is. Can you actually tell us more about what you believe has brought the PLO to where it is today, namely in its visible absence and inaction, especially during the latest Unity Intifada?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Nadim, for having me on and for discussing this subject, which I think is really crucial. And you put it very well. It's a very visible absence of the PLO during this uprising, the Unity Intifada, and everything that's been going on regarding the Palestinian people and their cause. So just to recap that the PLO's heyday was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And ironically, it's worth remembering that during that time, one of the biggest demands of the Palestinian movement was recognition by the West of the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. I would say the downward spiral speeded up after Yasser Arafat's death in 2004, but the seeds were planted well before then when Arafat agreed to establish the Palestinian National Authority, supposedly for a 5-year period. Instead, it grew gradually in importance because it controlled money, jobs, and other resources. And the PLO, which was supposed to be the umbrella unifying structure for the entire Palestinian people, gradually shrank with the signing of the Oslo Accords. And instead, the focus on the occupied Palestinian territory and led to the exclusion of the refugees and exiles, who became increasingly alienated from the PLO. And the PLO was further hollowed out, in fact, by the continued exclusion of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which, like it or not, have significant weight amongst a substantial segment of the Palestinian people. And that's to say nothing of the PA's actions in terms of military coordination with Israel and its crackdowns on the people within its control, under its control. There's been no serious effort to reestablish the PLO's representativity of the Palestinian people through, for example, meaningful and credible convenings of the Palestinian National Council, the PNC, or other bodies. And it's really ironic that when recognition by the PLO, of the PLO by the West, the Western international community, was achieved at the beginning of the Oslo process, that's when the PLO's power and leadership began to fade away. Now the PLO takes its orders basically from Mahmoud Abbas, and the fact that he and the PA are under Israel's thumb obviously impacts on the PLO's credibility, because Abbas, as Arafat did before him, heads both the PLO and the PA. I'll stop here to leave room for more discussion and questions later on.
Thank you, Nadia, especially for the historical perspective and the irony, as you said, of the delegitimization, or the sort of the initial demise of the PLO coming in tandem with the formation of the PA. Zaha, I'd like to turn to you next. In spite of the PLO's absence from the Palestinian political sphere over the last few years, Palestinians across the world continue to forge networks and connections in solidarity in their struggle against Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism. What would be the benefit of reviving the PLO at this stage?
Thanks, Nadim, and thanks Al-Shabaka for having us and for supporting this project that resulted in this paper. There are really two questions embedded in your question, Nadim. The first is, why do Palestinians or any people struggling for national liberation need a national leadership? And the second is why this should be the PLO. As to why the need for national representation, of course, leadership is necessary because those struggling for their rights as a people need to be able to speak their demands with one voice. National representation means having someone articulate your history, narrative, and claims to the world authoritatively. But it also means having the ability to assert Palestinian collective and individual claims in international fora, or having the ability to accede to international agreements and treaties like the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, or the Covenant on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which includes an interstate complaint mechanism, for example. And it means being able to negotiate a peace treaty for the benefit of all Palestinians as a collective and as individuals. Now, as to the question of why the PLO, well, the PLO is a creature of Palestinian organizing over many decades. It was a major achievement for a people, the majority of whom had been violently dispersed from their homeland. For Palestinians to have been able to come together under one umbrella, despite their geographic fragmentation and their political differences, to assert their peoplehood, their rights, and their claims wasn't a very small feat. It took more than 2 decades after 1948 for Palestinians to have a legitimate national representation that was recognized by as such throughout the world. To give that up would mean starting from scratch today, and it would be much more difficult to do given the forces at play today that would fight against it, including from within the Palestinian polity. Even groups standing outside the umbrella of the PLO, like Hamas, recognize that the PLO is the only legitimate national representative for Palestinians. Now think about it. How would Palestinians be able to pursue accountability at the International Criminal Court today without recognition of the PLO as the government of the state of Palestine? If it was, if the PLO hadn't acceded to the Rome Statute, then we wouldn't have, and we didn't have recognition of the state of Palestine by the UN, we wouldn't have been able to pursue accountability in the ICC. With all of the problems with the PLO today, which we discuss at length in the study for Al-Shabaka, most of the PLO's critics do not want to see the PLO go. They want to see it restored and strengthened to fulfill its mission for all Palestinians. The PLO is the only link the diaspora has at the moment to historic Palestine, which exists as an imagined community, as political scientist Benedict Anderson would say. The PA can't be that link, as Nadia noted. It does not represent the Palestinians and the diaspora, and only the PLO exists today that can do that.
Thank you, Zaha, for clarifying the extent to which the PLO is in fact not irrelevant, and that there would be value in reviving it and re-engaging its different offices and members. I'd like to actually get more into the study itself and the findings of the study. In the study, you investigate those sort of significant developments within the PLO and its diplomatic corps of the past few decades, and you offer policy recommendations for different sections of the PLO across the diaspora. Nadia, can you tell us more about these findings, perhaps giving us examples of when things worked well for the PLO, and then alternatively when things didn't work so well in terms of the PLO's actions?
Thanks, Nadim, and these are really good questions. I would say I want to point out that, of course, our study is focused on the PLO diplomatic corps, and Al-Shabaka put out another study on the PLO also a few months before ours, which tackled the broader aspect of the PLO, including, for example, how to bring Hamas and Islamic Jihad into the fold, including describing how decision-making used to be made by consensus, not by elections, when the PLO was in exile, and other areas. So we're focused basically on the diplomatic corps because we wanted to really look at the interaction between the diplomatic corps with the Palestinian diaspora, especially since the diaspora tends to be overlooked in discussions about Palestinians in general. But in fact, the diaspora is an arena where Palestinians have great freedom of action and speech. However, due to the weakness of the PLO as an effective national body, as Zaha was saying, and the alienation of much of the diaspora from the current PA-based leadership, diaspora activism is not as powerful or as strong as it could be, or as impactful as it could be. And heaven knows we do badly need to rebuild our sources of power. So that's really why we undertook this study, is to investigate this as a potential source of power. So the question is, to what extent could the diplomatic corps serve as an entry point to reviving our national movement for Palestinian freedom and liberation? We interviewed diplomats, Palestinians in the diaspora, and civil society organizations that support the Palestinian people's struggle. We found that often Palestinian diplomats did not have it easy themselves because of the confusion. Are they PLO diplomats? Are they PA diplomats? Who do they respond to? What are their responsibilities? And that impacted on their ability to engage with the diaspora. They are also obviously, as the diplomats, affected by the Fatah-Hamas divide, and it's extremely embarrassing for them to have to address the PA's human rights record or try to defend that, defending the indefensible. Still, we found that PLO missions led by seasoned diplomats were able to really advance Palestinian interests within the country of posting or the international body to which they were assigned. Whether it was at the UN or elsewhere, as Zaha pointed out. Now, we selected some specific events all in the past decade to study to see what the interaction was between the PLO and the diaspora. For example, the initiative to upgrade Palestine's status at the UN from observer mission to a non-member state mission was generally seen as a very well-organized effort with clear goals, a clear direction, good communications, and messaging. And the core worked smoothly as a smoothly functioning system, not just in the country of posting, but this is interesting, across all countries, so really representing the Palestinian people at large. Because of the effectiveness of the organization of the PLO, some diaspora activists who previously distanced themselves from the PLO and the PNA willingly engaged in the statehood bid initiative. In particular, because it reasserted Palestinian agency and challenged US control of the agenda. So that was a kind of successful interaction between the PLO and the diaspora. A very bad example of engagement between the PLO and the diaspora was the convening of the Palestinian National Council in 2018. For example, in one country where the community had previously given the PNC elections a very important, gave it actually the highest importance in their interaction with the PLO, they found that there were unilateral moves by the mission, and in the end, the representatives were nominated by Ramallah, they said. In another country, the process was supposed to be totally ad hoc and non-transparent. In a third, the process was described as having led to a PNC that was absolutely did not represent the Palestinian people. These are quotes from the Palestinian members of the diaspora that we interviewed. As you pointed out earlier, despite all these setbacks and criticisms, in fact, none of the interviewees that we spoke to amongst the diaspora questioned the legitimacy of the PLO as a national representative of the Palestinian people and an organization that represented the Palestinian people, even when they were highly critical of it.
Thank you, Nadia, for getting into the study, into the meat of it. Again, like with Zaha and the previous question, you really sort of point out clearly the reasons for why the PLO is not totally obsolete and should be invested in as something worth reviving, as a power, as your study indicates. Zaha, I'd like for you to tell us, sort of give us an example, if you would, of specifically how this power could be put into practice. So given these findings that Nadia explored or explained, what do you believe the PLO could have contributed in this moment in Palestinian history in the Unity Intifada, had it been re-engaged and re-empowered and revived? What could the Palestinians themselves have achieved with their legitimate representation behind them and supporting them?
Thanks. Well, when we think about the events of May and June, and even continuing on today in Jerusalem, in the occupied territories and in historic Palestine, what we witnessed was an assertion of Palestinian rights and an assertion of Palestinian claims from 1948, with a line being drawn from then through to today. 2021. It wasn't just a unity intifada of fragmented people holding different colored IDs and passports. It was a unity of their claims. So when we think about where the PLO was during those months, we see it was missing entirely. The Palestinian national institution that was visible was the PA, and it was acting to manage the protests in the jurisdictions where they have some control, rather than to lead or support them. Its goal was to prove its bona fides as a peace partner for Israel and the U.S. It really wasn't to lead the people, to coordinate on messaging, or to amplify what was happening, spontaneously by Palestinians on the ground. The PA saw the moment as a point of leverage to be used to get back to the peace process and confidence-building measures towards relaunching negotiations. So its asks were tailored to that agenda: reopening the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, getting taxes that Israel collects on its behalf returned without the deductions that it takes because of the prisoner social welfare benefits. And it asked for it to be the coordinator of Gaza reconstruction once the bombardment of Gaza ended. So the PA was incapable of reflecting the demands of the Unity Intifada because it is not the right address for those demands to be made. It's not the voice of Palestinians everywhere. Its agenda is much more limited, and it stands actually in opposition to the PLO on relations with Israel. If you look at PLO resolutions from the PNC, it talks about not, withdrawing recognition of Israel. It talks about ending security coordination with Israel. These are issues that are directly in opposition to the very reason for the PA being. So obviously this situation is really dysfunctional, and it's highly problematic for the movement, particularly given that there are many actors who wish to see the PLO completely trivialized in favor of the PA so as to forego 1948 claims. For them, the PLO is only relevant for signing a peace agreement that would foreclose those claims. The PLO needs to reassert its role as the sole legitimate representative, and it needs to put the PA, its agent, in check and rethink the role of the PA moving forward entirely. If we had a PLO during, the escalations that we saw in May and June, we would have had a national leadership that could have articulated Palestinian claims. It could have then used the leverage of that moment to reassert the agenda and recalibrate the focus where it needs to be at this moment. But instead, what we saw was the PA pulling in a very different direction that really was counterproductive to what the civil society, what Palestinians writ large were calling for at that moment.
Sorry about that, my cursor got stuck. Thank you, Zaha, for getting into exactly why, at this moment, there is value in reviving the PLO. I would like to finally, since the study is so rich and robust, and I want to give our audience a chance to also visit, or I encourage our audience to check out the study on our website. But I want to ask you both to, I'd like to pose a question to you both and give you each a chance to share your insights. What can be done to revive and engage the PLO and its diplomatic corps internationally, and to make it, to the extent possible, effective? This based on the policy recommendations you recommend in your study. Nadia, let's start with you and then turn to Zaha. We're doing great on time, so please feel free to take your time.
Thank you. Yeah, we try to be disciplined as authors of the PLO study. I think Zaha put very, very well the reasons for which we do need a PLO. It's going to be a real challenge to get from here to there, to reclaim our PLO and to make it our national movement once more, and to leap over somehow the Palestinian Authority or put it in its place. But we have no choice, I think, but to try to get there. It's very hard. It would be impossible to start from scratch, as also mentioned in her previous response. So we have, again, to emphasize that our study focused on the PLO diplomatic corps, and we have recommendations for the diaspora in their dealings with the diplomatic corps and for the diplomatic corps. I'll focus on the ones to the diaspora and leave those aimed at the diplomatic corps to Zaha. As difficult as it might be, because a lot of members of the diaspora tend to shun the PLO office in their country, but as difficult as it might be, members of the diaspora could try to convene forums, or should try to convene forums with representatives of the diplomatic corps to discuss the direction of the Palestinian National Project, including the need to end security coordination with Israel, as well as authoritarianism in Palestine. Diaspora activists could also try to find ways to bridge, to help to bridge the split between Fatah and Hamas, which extends to the diaspora just as it does at home. They could collaborate on initiatives with the PLO on initiatives to push back against Israel's campaign to conflate criticisms of its actions to anti-Semitism, which would be an important arena, and one which is neutral politically, that all Palestinians and our allies need help with. And I think one of the most important recommendations we've made is for diaspora representatives to demand that the PLO Executive Committee appoint and empower an ombudsperson to respond to diaspora complaints and concerns about missions work, should there be any, if those complaints are not addressed at the mission level. I'll hand it over to Zaha now to take it forward.
So we did have a number of recommendations for different parts of the PLO and the PA leadership. Specifically, and most importantly, we talk about the need to revisit the national project and the need for a national dialogue to start that process. As I mentioned earlier, there really is this disconnect between what Palestinians writ large, Palestinians in the diaspora, as well as Palestinians still in the homeland, with what they are asking for and where the Palestinian leadership is, and specifically the PA is. And so there really is an important prerequisite to reform that needs to take place, and that's just in having the conversation, so that we can revisit the idea of a two-state solution, talk about whether or not that's still practical or desirable given the moment that we're in and the challenges that we're facing, and whether that is actually going to realize Palestinian aspirations ultimately. And again, we don't prejudge that conversation, but we absolutely think it's important to have, and the PLO is the address for calling for such a dialogue. As Nadia mentioned, we also want to see an ombudsman office created so that Palestinians in the diaspora can ensure that their engagement with PLO missions and embassies abroad is one that's productive and where they are being heard, and that they are able to ensure that those offices are receptive and serving the communities in which they're located. We also call for the PLO Central Council to review the Palestinian Authority functions. As we note in the study, there has been a deterioration of the PLO functions in favor of transferring those functions over to the Palestinian Authority. Right now, we actually have parallel bodies in both the PLO and the PNA, or the Palestinian Authority. They operate in parallel, but in reality, those departments and bureaus that are in the PLO are dormant in favor of the Palestinian Authority ministries. And so we call on the Central Council to review how this process has taken place over the last some years, 2 decades now, and to reform so that the PLO is the responsible body, particularly when it comes to its political department. The political department of the PLO is responsible for the diplomatic corps, and currently the Palestinian Authority Ministry of Foreign Affairs has taken on that role. And the problem with that, obviously, is that it's the PLO that represents Palestinians everywhere, including the diaspora, for their claims as well as just serving their needs. And the Palestinian Authority represents the people that are residing in the occupied territories. And so transferring that representative function to the Palestinian Authority effectively leaves the diaspora without a representative. And so we ask for that to be reviewed and to restore the work of the Palestinian political department. And so those are, basically the main things we call for. But there's also, in the past, we've had a much more vibrant PLO, one that really did a lot of outreach. And we don't see that anymore. One of the things that the PLO was very strong in was in educating its youth and mobilizing the youth about around Palestinian issues. And that office, the Youth and Mobilization Office in the PLO, has not been functioning. And so one of the things we also call for is a re-engagement of that office with the Palestinian diaspora, the youth population, to educate them on the importance of the PLO's history, what the PLO's achievements have been, what the PLO's challenges have been, so that we can really reinvigorate the Palestinian community in the work of the PLO.
Thank you so much to both of you. And we just got a request from one of our audience members to see the study and how to access it. So I think, given all that you've told us in the last question, I think we really encouraged our audience to visit the website and to really dig into this very meaty, rich study. Yes, you can access the study on our main website, and we will be emailing you the study following the policy lab. So thank you both for taking this time, the first 30 minutes. I'd like to turn now to the audience Q&A. We have a few questions. I've been sort of exploring them, trying to lump some of them thematically so that we try to get to as many as possible. Nadia, I'd like to start with you with a very sort of straightforward question that was the first question posed, in fact. I'll read it as is. The PLO has a fairly dismal record of making decisions and precipitating positive change for Palestinians. Why should we have faith in them now?
Well, I would say that the PLO is what we make it, what the Palestinian people ask of it, and what it does. And I don't know that its record has been that dismal over the decades. It's the attempt to achieve a state before achieving rights, really, before bringing Israel to the point and bringing the international community to the point where they recognize Palestinian rights and uphold them. And the haste to achieve a state, I think, is what set us on a downward track. But I don't know that before then that the PLO made disastrous or that had that terrible record. And especially the members of the diplomatic corps, there were some really terrific people and representatives and leaders who actually gave their lives for Palestine, who were assassinated by Israel and its the people that it used as assassins, and the people that it infiltrated within the ranks of the PLO. So I wouldn't agree that the record has been all that dismal. That said, we are in a pretty dismal place now, and we need to find ways to reclaim the PLO. To say that we want representation, especially those of us who live in the diaspora. We want representation, we demand representation, and we want an effective and functioning PLO, and we don't want to see it disappear. And there's a point, we face a danger point because, and Zaha can speak to this better than I can, but if the link between the PLO, which is headed by Abbas and was headed by Arafat, and the PA, which is headed by Abbas and was headed by Arafat, if that link is broken, then there won't be a way to reclaim the PLO anymore, because just having a head of a Palestinian Authority will be a big blow for our struggle. I'm sure Zaha would have something to add to my answer, which.
Please, by all means, Zaha. Thank you, Nadia.
Yeah, as Nadia was saying, during the course of the history of the PA, as responsibilities were being transferred quietly from the PLO to the PA, the only really link that remains that asserts the PLO's authority over the Palestinian Authority is the office of the president of the Palestinian Authority, who also sits as chairman of the PLO and as president of the state of Palestine. So because that person happens to be the same person, that is the only way that the PLO still has some authority over the Palestinian Authority. If Mahmoud Abbas passes away or he is no longer president, then we wouldn't have the same person holding all of those offices. And so then we would have a disconnect. There would be a Palestinian Authority completely independent of a PLO that is now completely weakened and disempowered, and leaving really Palestinians in the diaspora without any sort of weight within the national movement and within the national movement's leadership. And so that's the danger that has been created over these many years as the Palestinian Authority was bolstered because of its role in setting up a state while still under occupation.
So thank you, Zaha. Zaha, I'd like to actually stay with you for a moment, and since you began speaking about the PA. In your answer, really most of our questions relate to the PA, and rather than read them all aloud to you, I will just sort of summarize them by saying, and what of the PA, and what could that something like, should the PA be done away with? If so, how? What does it mean for the PLO to put the PA in check? What is the sort of feasibility for something like this to happen, and how likely is something like this to happen? Zaha, and then I'd like Nadia, for such a big question, and our audience is really interested in this, so I'd like to give you a chance as well to answer after Zaha. Go ahead. Yeah,
I'll speak to it as a legal issue, and I'll let Nadia speak to it more on the political level. As the Palestinian Authority was set up, it was set up to be merely an agent of the PLO. The PLO is really the decision-making body. It gave life to the Palestinian Authority, and it can take it away. Theoretically and legally, it can take it away. The Oslo framework has really expired. I don't think there's anyone that really seriously questions that we are no longer within that framework anymore. And so if the Palestinian Authority is a creature of Oslo, and Oslo is no longer a viable framework, then what is the purpose of the Palestinian Authority, and should there be something to replace it? I think that's a question that's has been asked for quite some time now. More and more settlements were being constructed, and as the two-state solution looked more and more impracticable, it became clear that the Palestinian Authority was losing its reason for being. And so that question's been asked for quite some time. I think it's gained a lot more urgency because as the two-state solution has become foreclosed, we've also seen on the ground with the Palestinian leadership, more and more, a rise of illiberalism and authoritarianism that culminated in what we saw recently with the killing of Nizar Banat and the protests after that, and the PA response. I think there's a renewed urgency for rethinking the Palestinian Authority. How to do that legally, yeah, like I said, is a matter for the PLO. And unfortunately, because we don't have an active and vibrant PLO, because we haven't had real PLO elections, even under the antiquated PLO quota system, we haven't had serious bringing in of new blood. That process can't really take place. And also because, as I said, the only link between the PLO and the PA and the PLO having authority over the PA is the Mahmoud Abbas and his position as chairman of the PLO and president of the state of Palestine and president of the PA. That's who that's where the decision making will have to fall practically. And of course, that's a problem given that there's the call is for him to step down. The call has been in protest for the PA to be disbanded. So how do you do that? And I'll pass it on to Nadia to talk about some of the recommendations that we had in the report about how to do that.
Thank you, Zaha. Yeah, it's a very difficult and very tricky question, and I think I think this is where the diaspora has to play a major role, because it has the freedom to do so. And it has, as I was saying earlier, it has the opportunity to reach out to representatives and call on them to respond to the demands of the Palestinian people and to organize within the countries they're in, either protest movements or movements of support for the PLO representatives there, and to really try and push to that effect. The Palestinian Authority should shrink to what it used to be, or what it should have been, which is just a manager of the occupied territories. It won't be easy because of the money, because when you have I believe it's 1.5 people who depend on the Palestinian Authority for a living and on the funds that it gets from donor countries and the management that it puts into that, it won't be difficult. It won't be easy to do away with it and to do away with that and to condemn people just to be without funds or without schooling or without education or whatever. The Palestinian Authority needs to shrink back to a manager of the territory that it controls, much like the heads of the cities and used to be in the council heads used to be before the Palestinian Authority was established. And so and then I think it really is up to the diaspora to try and connect and organize across Palestinian divisions, both geographic and political.
I just want to amplify something Nadia said. There is a need for a Palestinian Authority or something like a Palestinian Authority, because as Nadia pointed out, it is a service provider. And if anything was driven home during the COVID-19 crisis, it was the fact that, you really do need, an administrator on the ground that puts Palestinian lives, first and centers them. You can't rely on the occupation to do a lot of the functions that the PA has been doing. Of course, the PA is challenged in its role as service provider, whether that's in terms of healthcare or in terms of the education system or the myriad ways in which, a state operates or any kind of municipal authority operates. But at the same time, it plays an important role, and that that's necessary and that's needed. We simply can't turn back the clocks and go back to the time period when the Israeli occupation provided all of these services. There's been a lot that's happened on the ground since then. So in reimagining the role of the Palestinian Authority, it's going to take, as we note in the study, it's going to take some thought by the PLO institutions, the PLO bodies like the Palestinian National Council, but you can't have meaningful dialogue in that body so long as it's not renewed, the membership's not renewed in a way that's democratic and representative of all of the diaspora.
Thank you both for taking the time to really get at this hot question, let's say, in this discussion. I have 3 more questions that are gaining votes and attention. I'd like to get to them all within 15 minutes. I think we can. You're both very succinct and concise in your answers. So Nadia, I'd like to pose the first one to you. The Palestinian struggle is a struggle against apartheid. Neither the PLO, Hamas, nor the PA have progressed this struggle. It was done by a new generation who are more in touch with world sentiment. It appears the most promising path for Palestinians. How qualified is the PLO or the PA to lead this type of resistance? This new type of resistance?
Yeah, I would agree, actually, that it is somewhat it is definitely out of touch with developments. It was, and I would say that it was, I'm very glad that young Palestinians were so prominent in it, but it is a multi-generational movement, and I think we have to recognize that. For example, the BDS movement, which is a big power for Palestinians, is multi-generational, and the more we recognize multi-generational efforts, the better it is. That said, the youth have played a very major role in putting Palestine back on the map in the past several months. I think it depends where you are. In some countries, and I don't want to be specific, in some countries there are PLO representatives that are open to listening, and I think one could reach out to them and get them to take some actions, to recognize the changes that have been happening, and to somehow open up rather than close down. So I think in some places it's possible perhaps to do that, but there's no question that, as Zaha said, we need a much more representative PLO, but we're the ones who have to make it. I think it would be, we can't start from scratch, and there's nothing at the moment that can translate all the efforts that have been made, all the sacrifices that have been made in the resistance by the youth and others. Others who've been active in that resistance movement. There's nothing to translate that into a political victory. How do you translate that? We've always had some form of leadership. There was leadership of the first Intifada, because there was the space then to organize, and it was able to establish itself as leadership before, in a sense, it was a bit somewhat co-opted by the PLO and taken down the Oslo track, which was a disaster. So I think we can't let go of the PLO. We just have to find ways, as we've argued in this study, as was argued in the previous study by Al-Shabaka, ways to reclaim it.
Thank you, Nadia. Zaha, I asked the same question to you, but with another question from another audience member. As Nadia mentioned, BDS, the First Intifada, the March of Return, the Unity Intifada, they've been significant non-PLO civic grassroots initiatives, right? How can the PLO work as a genuinely democratic and grassroots organization? And this is part of the question I'd like to focus on. Can or should technology facilitate a new virtual Palestinian body?
I mean, all of the really successful civil society-led initiatives that you just listed, Nadim, those were all things that have happened since we lost the PLO as sort of the decision maker, and as it has become weakened by the existence of the Palestinian Authority. So I don't think that it's accurate to say that that we couldn't have a reinvigorated PLO that then could support these kinds of civil society-led initiatives and make them more successful and leverage them into actual political wins. I mean, that's the whole point of having a national leadership, is that how do you translate these kinds of initiatives into political wins, and the need for it, because yes, we've had all of these amazing efforts by Palestinians all around coming together and organizing in support of them, but we aren't any closer to realizing our national aspirations than we were before. But we've gained in terms of international solidarity. We've gained in terms of consciousness awareness, raising, and that's really critical and important if you want to get to a political victory, right? So I don't think it militates a decision that we are beyond a national leadership. It's actually underscoring the very real ways in which we need one in order to turn these wins by the civil society into actual political wins. Can a virtual kind of leadership do that for us? I would say not, because just for the same reasons that when I talked about why you need a national leadership when you're trying to realize political aspirations, is because you need to speak in that one voice. You need to be able to access legal mechanisms. You need to be able to engage in a kind of diplomacy, and you need to have international recognition of that representation in order to do that. And I don't see that a virtual kind of leadership is going to have the same power and impact on that international level to be able to do that. What it is really great for, though, is the building of capacities and skills and the coordinating of messaging and organizing that's going to make these efforts all the more effective. And it's also going to be not just effective vis-a-vis, our Palestinian struggle against, Israeli oppression and occupation and apartheid. It's going to be all the more effective in terms of Palestinian organizing within Palestine and within Palestinian national institutions. Now, as successful as Palestinians have been to utilize these things to raise awareness and consciousness around the world, they need to be turned internally too, to help push for the kinds of dialogues and the kinds of engagement with the Palestinian leadership and the PLO to help make the changes that we're talking about in the PLO study.
Thank you, Zaha. Nadia, a final question to you. Zaha, if you'd like to also pitch in, by all means, this is a big question. Diplomats and the international community continue to preach for a two-state solution as framed within the Oslo Accords. The recent events and delegitimization of the PA clearly shows that there is a dire need for the diplomats and foreign states to change their discourse. What can be done to influence them towards changing their broken discourse? And I believe that this audience member is wondering what the PLO perhaps could do to change the discourse, but perhaps broader than the PLO as well.
Is it the question to change the discourse to say that we need a one-state solution, or is it to change the discourse? I'm not quite clear on that, but that's okay.
Well, perhaps you could answer it from multiple angles. You know, if it were to change it to a one state, what would need to be done?
I would counsel very, very carefully keeping the two-state solution on the books, on the cards, as it were, without, while at the same time pushing for a one-state solution. It's okay, I think, to have because we're nowhere near freedom, we're nowhere near liberation. I think it's okay to do both because the two-state solution is what has the support of the international community. It's where we have the power to engage at the UN. It's where we have our representativity, is the calling for the two-state solution. And if we were to say we wanted a one-state solution, or we wanted a single state in Palestine and Israel, we might lose that representativity at the UN. We might lose our status as Palestinian agents, and I use agents in a good as a good term here rather than a bad one, an agency as Palestinians. So the fact that we pushed for and established a framework of a two-state solution, I think we should continue to exploit that and use that. Nothing stops us from saying we are equally pushing for a situation where we could have our rights in a single state, where all citizens are equal, all citizens have their rights, where refugees have their rights as well to return, and exiles have the right to return, and that fulfills all Palestinian rights. We're not near either of these at the moment, but what we do need to get is a PLO that is far more authentic, far more representative, and far more responsive to what's going on the ground, rather than becoming far more distant and isolated from and hollowed out from what's going on.
Thank you so much, Nadia. I think this is a good place to stop our Q&A on such a powerful note, and with the real recommendations what the PLO should do and look like. Unfortunately, we have also run out of time. We have 3 minutes before closing, and I just want to thank you both so much, not just for joining us today, but also for contributing such a powerful study to Al-Shabaka's, developing repertoire. Thank you also for sharing your insights today into this undeniably important topic: the value, the relevance, the future of the PLO within the ongoing liberation struggle of Palestinians. While in many ways an absent and inactive entity, your findings in the study and your comments today make clear that it's not altogether obsolete, and that it can, and indeed should, be revived, reshaped, re-engaged, to represent new generations of Palestinians resisting in new ways. The process will require tremendous effort from Palestinians and their representatives globally, but it is not without value. So thank you both. I'd also like to thank our audience all over the world for attending and for submitting such thoughtful and engaging questions. But before we sign off, I'd like to remind everyone that Policy Labs are a crowdfunded program of Al-Shabakas, so we do rely on your continued support. If you are able to donate, please do so by clicking on the donate link that should now appear on your screens. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you. Goodbye.